There are moments in life when the ordinary becomes extraordinary, when the mundane rhythm of existence is shattered by something so profound that it forces us to question everything we thought we knew about reality itself. For Michael Thompson, a 42-year-old high school history teacher from Portland, Oregon, that moment arrived on a rain-soaked Tuesday afternoon in October, when his heart stopped beating and he crossed into a realm that medicine cannot fully explain and science struggles to comprehend. What happened to him during those 10 minutes of clinical death would not only transform his own life, but would send ripples of unease through everyone who heard his story, leaving them to wonder whether death is truly the end or merely a doorway to something far more disturbing than we've ever imagined. Michael had always been the kind of person who blended into the background of life, not because he lacked substance, but because he found comfort in predictability. He had taught American history at Lincoln High School for nearly 2 decades, living alone in a modest craftsman-style house in the Alberta Arts District, surrounded by towering Douglas firs and the perpetual mist that characterizes the Pacific Northwest. His days followed a pattern so routine that you could set your watch by them. He woke at 6:15 each morning, brewed a pot of dark roast coffee that filled his kitchen with the rich aroma of Colombian beans, and spent exactly 30 minutes reading the newspaper before heading to school. His colleagues described him as reliable, quietly intelligent, someone who brought a genuine passion to teaching the Revolutionary War and the Civil Rights Movement. His students respected him, though they rarely saw beyond the carefully constructed walls of professionalism he maintained. Michael kept his personal life private, partly because there wasn't much to share, and partly because he had learned long ago that solitude was safer than vulnerability. The truth was that Michael had been running from something for most of his adult life, though he would never have admitted it in those terms. 20 years earlier, his younger sister Emma had died in a car accident, and the grief had hollowed him out in ways that time never quite healed. She had been 17, full of dreams about becoming a marine biologist, obsessed with saving the oceans and discovering new species in the deep. Michael had been driving that night. A drunk driver had blown through a red light and T-boned them on the passenger side, killing Emma instantly. The guilt had burrowed into his soul like a parasite, feeding on his happiness, his relationships, his ability to connect with others on any meaningful level. He had undergone therapy, had been told repeatedly that he wasn't to blame, but the rational mind and the wounded heart rarely speak the same language. So he built his life around structure and control, believing that if he could just maintain order, if he could keep everything predictable, then nothing terrible could ever happen again. He was wrong. October 17th began like any other Tuesday. The rain hammered against Michael's bedroom window, a relentless percussion that had been the soundtrack of his life for as long as he could remember. He went through his morning routine with mechanical precision, sipping his coffee while reading about the latest political turmoil, checking his lesson plans for the day's classes on the Cold War, gathering his worn leather satchel that smelled faintly of old books and chalk dust. The drive to school took 23 minutes through streets slick with fallen leaves and reflected streetlights. He parked in his usual spot, nodded to the janitor who was emptying trash bins near the entrance, and made his way to his classroom on the 2nd floor. The hallways echoed with the chaotic energy of teenagers, their laughter and shouts bouncing off lockers covered in homecoming posters and club advertisements. Michael unlocked his classroom door, turned on the lights, and began writing the day's agenda on the whiteboard. Everything was normal. Everything was under control. And then, without warning, everything changed. It happened during 3rd period, while Michael was mid-sentence explaining the significance of the Cuban Missile Crisis to a classroom of 32 sophomores who were varying degrees of engaged. He had been describing the 13 days in October 1962 when the world stood on the precipice of nuclear annihilation, when Kennedy and Khrushchev played a high-stakes game of chicken that could have ended civilization as we know it. The irony of that moment would not be lost on him later, how he was speaking about humanity's brush with extinction just as he was about to experience his own. He was reaching for a map of Cuba that hung on the wall when the pain struck him. A sensation so sudden and overwhelming that it drove him to his knees. It felt like someone had wrapped steel cables around his chest and was tightening them with mechanical force, crushing his ribs, squeezing the air from his lungs. The room tilted and spun, the faces of his students blurring into a kaleidoscope of shock and confusion. He heard someone scream, heard the clatter of desks being shoved aside, felt hands grabbing at his shoulders as he collapsed onto the scuffed linoleum floor. The next thing Michael would remember with any clarity was the ceiling tiles passing overhead, fluorescent lights creating a strobe effect as he was rushed down the hallway on a gurney. The paramedics were shouting medical jargon he didn't understand, their voices urgent and strained. He tried to speak, to ask what was happening, but his mouth wouldn't form words. His vision was narrowing, darkness creeping in from the edges like a vignette effect in an old photograph. The pain in his chest had evolved into something else entirely, a cold, spreading numbness that felt like he was being submerged in ice water. He could hear the wail of the ambulance siren, could feel the vibrations of the vehicle moving through traffic, but it all seemed distant, muffled, as if he were experiencing it from underwater. Someone was performing chest compressions, the rhythmic pressure on his sternum delivered with desperate intensity. A voice kept saying his name, kept telling him to stay with them, to keep fighting, but he could feel himself slipping away, pulled by a current stronger than any act of will could resist. And then, at exactly 2:47 in the afternoon, according to the hospital records that would later document this incident, Michael Thompson's heart stopped beating and he died. What happened next would haunt him for the rest of his life. The medical term for what Michael experienced is sudden cardiac arrest, a catastrophic electrical malfunction of the heart that strikes without warning and kills 90% of its victims before they ever reach a hospital. For reasons that the cardiologists at Providence Portland Medical Center would later struggle to explain, Michael's heart had simply stopped firing the electrical impulses necessary to maintain its rhythm. One moment it was pumping blood through his body with the reliability it had demonstrated for 42 years, and the next it was still, silent, a useless muscle that transformed him from a living person into a corpse in the span of seconds. The paramedics had worked on him with frantic determination during the 12-minute ambulance ride, performing CPR with textbook precision, administering epinephrine, shocking his chest with the defibrillator in desperate attempts to restart the engine of his existence. Nothing worked. By the time they wheeled him through the emergency room doors, he had been clinically dead for 6 minutes and 17 seconds. The emergency room at Providence was a controlled chaos of beeping monitors, rushing footsteps, and barked orders that created a symphony of urgency. Dr. Sarah Chen, a 38-year-old cardiologist who had seen more than her share of code blues during her 15-year career, took one look at the flat line on Michael's EKG monitor and felt the familiar weight of impossible odds settling onto her shoulders. But she had not gone into medicine to accept defeat easily. She ordered another round of epinephrine, instructed her team to continue compressions, and personally took control of the defibrillator paddles. The first shock lifted Michael's body off the gurney, his muscles contracting in an involuntary spasm that looked almost violent in its intensity, but the monitor remained flat. The second shock produced the same result. The third, the fourth. Dr. Chen could feel the eyes of her team on her, could sense their growing conviction that they were fighting a battle already lost. But something in her refused to give up. She had learned early in her career that medicine existed in the space between science and stubbornness, between what the textbook said was possible and what sheer human will could sometimes accomplish. At 8 minutes and 43 seconds, one of the nurses gently suggested that they call it, that they record the time of death, and move on to the other emergencies demanding their attention. Dr. Chen looked at Michael's face, at the pallor that had settled over his skin like a gray mask, at the stillness that seemed so profoundly wrong for a man who had been alive and teaching children just minutes before. She thought about his family, whoever they might be, waiting somewhere to receive the worst news any human being can hear. She thought about the arbitrary nature of death, how it could reach out and pluck someone from the middle of an ordinary day for no reason that made any sense at all. And she thought about her own father, who had died of a heart attack when she was in medical school, how the doctors had given up on him after 7 minutes. She was not ready to give up on Michael Thompson. She ordered one more round of medication, one more shock, and she leaned over his body and whispered something that no one else in the room could hear, a plea or a prayer, or perhaps just a refusal to accept the finality of death. The monitor beeped, once, then again, and then it settled into an irregular but unmistakable rhythm. Michael's heart was beating. The room erupted in controlled celebration, the kind of subdued triumph that medical professionals allow themselves when they have wrestled someone back from the edge of oblivion. Dr. Chen felt her own heart hammering in her chest, adrenaline flooding her system as she watched the numbers on the monitor stabilize. 10 minutes and 12 seconds. That was how long Michael had been dead. 10 minutes and 12 seconds without oxygen flowing to his brain, without his heart pumping blood through his veins, without any of the biological processes that separate the living from the dead. By every reasonable medical expectation, he should have suffered catastrophic brain damage. If he woke up at all, the textbook suggested he would be severely impaired, possibly vegetative, a shell of the person he had been. But the human body is not a machine that follows predictable rules, and sometimes it surprises even the experts who have dedicated their lives to understanding it. Michael opened his eyes 17 hours later in the cardiac intensive care unit, surrounded by the antiseptic smell of hospital cleaning solution and the steady beeping of monitors tracking every aspect of his physiology. The first thing he saw was the acoustic tile ceiling, water-stained and marked with patterns that looked almost deliberate, almost meaningful, like a code he should be able to decipher but couldn't. The second thing he saw was Dr. Chen's face leaning into his field of vision, her dark eyes wide with something that looked like astonishment mixed with scientific curiosity. She asked him if he knew his name, if he knew where he was, if he understood what had happened to him. Michael's throat felt like sandpaper, his voice emerging as barely more than a croak, but he answered each question correctly. His name was Michael James Thompson. He was in a hospital. His heart had stopped. He had died. And then, with an intensity that startled both of them, he grabbed Dr. Chen's wrist with surprising strength and said the words that would echo through the corridors of the hospital and eventually make their way into medical journals and news reports and late-night conversations about the nature of death itself. He said, "We're not supposed to come back. They told me we're not supposed to come back." Dr. Chen felt a chill run down her spine despite the warmth of the hospital room. She had worked with many cardiac arrest survivors, had heard all manner of stories about near-death experiences, about tunnels of light and feelings of peace, and encounters with deceased loved ones. She had learned to nod sympathetically, to neither encourage nor dismiss these accounts, to treat them as the brain's way of processing trauma, rather than as evidence of an afterlife. But there was something in Michael's eyes, a kind of haunted certainty that made her instinctively pull back from his grip. She asked him who had told him this, who he had encountered during those 10 minutes when he was clinically dead. Michael's gaze drifted to the window, where rain was streaking down the glass in rivulets that caught the grey afternoon light. When he spoke again, his voice was barely audible, and Dr. Chen had to lean closer to hear him over the ambient noise of the ICU. He said, "My sister, and the others. They were all there on the other side, and they were trying to stop me from coming back. They said I had broken something, that I had torn open something that was supposed to stay closed. They said there would be consequences." The neurological test that followed over the next 72 hours revealed something that defied medical explanation. Michael Thompson, who had been without oxygen to his brain for more than 10 minutes, showed no signs of the hypoxic brain injury that should have been catastrophic and irreversible. His cognitive functions were not only intact, but seemed somehow enhanced, sharper, as if the experience of death had stripped away some fog that normally clouds human perception. He could recall details from his past with photographic precision, could solve complex mathematical problems that had never interested him before, could read the emotional states of the nurses and doctors who examined him with uncanny accuracy. Dr. Chen documented every anomaly, filling her notes with observations that read more like science fiction than medical science. She consulted with neurologists, with psychiatrists, with colleagues who specialized in anoxic brain injuries, but no one could provide a satisfactory explanation for Michael's recovery. It was as if he had not merely survived death, but had returned from it fundamentally changed, rewired, transformed into something that occupied the uncertain space between the person he had been and something entirely new. But it was not the medical miracle of his recovery that would haunt everyone who encountered Michael in those early days after his resurrection. It was the warning he kept repeating, with increasing urgency and decreasing coherence, whenever anyone would listen. He spoke of a boundary that had been crossed, of rules that governed the separation between life and death, of consequences that were already beginning to manifest in ways he could sense but not yet articulate. The psychiatric evaluation diagnosed him with post-traumatic stress disorder, with survivor's guilt, with the expected psychological aftermath of a near-death experience. They prescribed medications to help him sleep, to calm his anxiety, to quiet the nightmares that jerked him awake in the pre-dawn hours. But Michael refused the pills, insisted that he needed to stay alert, that dulling his senses would make him vulnerable to something he could feel approaching like a storm on the horizon. The hospital staff began to avoid his room when possible, unsettled by the intensity of his gaze, by the way he would sometimes stop mid-conversation and tilt his head as if listening to voices only he could hear. On the 5th day of his hospitalization, something happened that would validate Michael's fears in the most horrifying way possible. One of the night shift nurses, a woman named Patricia Holloway who had been working at Providence for 23 years, went to check on Michael at 2:30 in the morning and found him sitting upright in bed, his eyes wide and unblinking, staring at the corner of the room where the shadows gathered most thickly. She asked him if he was all right, if he needed anything, if the pain medication was wearing off. Michael did not acknowledge her presence. He simply continued to stare at that corner, his breathing shallow and rapid, his hands gripping the bed rails with white-knuckled intensity. Patricia felt the temperature in the room drop, felt goosebumps rise on her arms despite the hospital's climate control maintaining a steady 72 degrees. And then Michael spoke, his voice flat and hollow, and what he said made Patricia back slowly toward the door. He said, "She's here. Emma's here, but she's not alone anymore. There are others with her now, and they're angry that the door was opened. They want to know why I was allowed to return when so many of them were not." Patricia reached for the call button, ready to summon help, ready to report that the patient was experiencing a psychotic break and needed immediate psychiatric intervention. But before she could press it, every light in the room flickered and died, plunging them into darkness, broken only by the faint green glow of the monitoring equipment. And in that darkness, Patricia would later swear in a statement that she gave to hospital security and then refused to discuss ever again. She heard something that sounded like whispers, dozens of overlapping voices speaking in languages she did not understand, all of them emanating from the corner where Michael continued to stare. The lights came back on after 3 seconds, though it felt like an eternity. Michael was still sitting upright, but now tears were streaming down his face, and when he finally looked at Patricia, she saw in his eyes a terror so profound that it transcended anything she had encountered in more than 2 decades of nursing. He opened his mouth to speak, and what came out was not his voice but something else entirely, something that sounded like multiple voices speaking in unison, and they delivered a message that would become the central mystery of everything that followed. They said, "The living are not meant to know what waits beyond, but he has seen, and now the veil is torn, and what lies beneath will not rest until balance is restored." The incident in Michael's hospital room was officially recorded as an electrical malfunction, a brief power fluctuation that affected only the cardiac intensive care unit for a matter of seconds before the backup generators kicked in and restored normal function. The hospital's maintenance department filed a report attributing the outage to a faulty circuit breaker, a mundane explanation for what Patricia Holloway knew in her bones had been anything but mundane. She requested a transfer to the day shift the following morning, citing personal reasons, and she never again spoke publicly about what she had witnessed in that room. But word spreads quickly in the enclosed ecosystem of a hospital. passed along in hushed conversations during shift changes, in the break room over bitter coffee, in the parking lot as exhausted staff made their way to their cars in the pre-dawn darkness. The story took on a life of its own, mutating and growing with each retelling until Michael Thompson became something of a legend among the nurses and orderlies and physician assistants who had never even met him, but who felt a collective unease about his presence in their hospital. Dr. Chen found herself caught between her scientific training and something she could not quite name, a growing conviction that Michael's case represented a phenomenon that existed outside the boundaries of conventional medical understanding. She began spending her off hours researching cases similar to Michael's, scrolling through medical databases and academic journals, looking for patterns in the experiences of cardiac arrest survivors who had been clinically dead for extended periods. What she discovered was a body of literature that existed on the fringes of mainstream medicine, studies and case reports that documented experiences so similar to Michael's that they could not be dismissed as mere coincidence or hallucination. There were hundreds of accounts, thousands perhaps, of people who had died and returned with stories of encountering deceased relatives, of being given messages or warnings, of coming back fundamentally altered in ways that defied neurological explanation. The medical establishment had largely categorized these experiences as the brain's response to oxygen deprivation, elaborate hallucinations produced by dying neurons firing in random patterns. But the more Dr. Chen read, the more she questioned whether that explanation was sufficient to account for the consistency of these experiences across cultures, across time periods, across the vast diversity of human consciousness. She found a paper published in a British medical journal by a cardiologist named Dr. Samuel Parnia, who had spent decades studying the phenomenon of near-death experiences with rigorous scientific methodology. His research suggested that consciousness might persist even after the brain ceased measurable activity, that what we think of as death might not be a moment but a process, a gradual transition during which awareness continues in some form that science had not yet learned to measure or understand. Dr. Chen printed the paper and read it 3 times, each reading deepening her sense that she was standing at the edge of a mystery that had profound implications not just for medicine, but for humanity's understanding of existence itself. She thought about Michael's insistence that he had been warned about consequences, about his sister's presence, about the others who had been angry about his return. And she thought about Patricia's account of the voices in the darkness, the way Michael's own voice had seemed to multiply and overlap with something that was not quite human. On the 7th day of his hospitalization, Dr. Chen made a decision that would change the trajectory of her career and her life. She contacted Dr. Parnia directly, sending him a detailed summary of Michael's case, along with all the medical records and test results that documented his impossible recovery. She expected a professional courtesy reply, perhaps a suggestion to publish the case in a medical journal, but what she received instead was a phone call less than 3 hours later. Dr. Parnia's voice carried a British accent and an urgency that surprised her. He told her that Michael's case was not unique, but rather part of a pattern he had been tracking for years, a subset of cardiac arrest survivors who came back with warnings about having violated some fundamental boundary between life and death. He said that these individuals almost always experienced what he called aftermath phenomena, events and occurrences that could not be explained by conventional means, manifestations that seemed to suggest their return had indeed torn open something that was meant to remain sealed. He asked if he could come to Portland to interview Michael directly, to document his experiences with the kind of rigorous attention that might yield insights into what was actually happening. Dr. Chen agreed, though she felt a knot of apprehension forming in her stomach, a sense that she was opening a door that might be better left closed. Michael was discharged from the hospital on the 9th day, his heart function mysteriously restored to normal despite the massive infarction that should have left permanent damage. The cardiologist who had overseen his care could offer no medical explanation for his recovery, only theories and speculation that felt hollow even as they spoke them. He was sent home with a list of follow-up appointments, prescriptions he had no intention of filling, and advice to avoid stress and maintain a healthy lifestyle. Recommendations that seemed almost absurd given the nature of what he had experienced. His colleagues at Lincoln High School had organized a fund to help with his medical expenses, had sent cards and flowers to the hospital, had expressed relief and joy at his survival. But when Michael returned to his craftsman house in the Alberta Arts District, walking through the door into rooms that smelled of stale coffee and unopened mail, he felt no relief or joy. He felt only a creeping dread that settled into his bones like arthritis, a certainty that his death had been only the beginning of something far worse. The house felt different, though he could not articulate exactly how. The shadows seemed darker, pooling in corners with an almost deliberate quality, as if they were gathering there for some purpose he could not fathom. The silence was too complete, the absence of sound so profound that it pressed against his eardrums like physical pressure. He walked from room to room, turning on every light, opening curtains to let in the grey October afternoon, but the sense of wrongness persisted. In the kitchen, he found that the clock on the microwave had stopped at 2:47, the exact time his heart had ceased beating. He unplugged it and plugged it back in, but the numbers remained frozen at that moment of his death. In the bathroom, the mirror was fogged despite the fact that no one had showered in more than a week, condensation clinging to the glass in patterns that looked almost like handprints, like someone had pressed their palms against it from the other side. And in his bedroom, he found his sister's journal lying open on his bed, a leather-bound book he kept in a locked box in his closet, an artifact from her short life that he had not looked at in years, because the pain of reading her teenage thoughts and dreams was too much to bear. The journal was open to the last entry she had ever written, dated the day before the accident that killed her. Michael sat on the edge of the bed, his hands trembling as he picked up the journal and read words he had memorized long ago, but which now seemed to carry new and terrible significance. Emma had written about a dream she'd had, a vivid nightmare in which she was drowning in dark water, sinking deeper and deeper despite her struggles to reach the surface. She had written that in the dream she could see light above her, could see the wavering outline of the world she was leaving behind, but something was pulling her down, something with many hands and many voices that whispered that she belonged with them now, that the boundary between life and death was not meant to be crossed. She had written that when she woke up, she felt certain the dream was trying to tell her something, a premonition or a warning that she could not quite interpret. The entry ended with a single line that made Michael's blood run cold as he read it in the context of everything that had happened to him. She had written, "I feel like I'm being prepared for something, like I'm being shown what waits on the other side, so I won't be afraid when my time comes. But Michael, if you're reading this someday after I'm gone, please know that I'll be watching over you, and if you ever try to follow me before your time, I'll do everything I can to send you back." Michael dropped the journal as if it had burned him, his breath coming in short gasps that bordered on hyperventilation. The implication was impossible, absurd, a coincidence that his traumatized mind was twisting into meaning where none existed. But he could not shake the memory of his sister's presence during those 10 minutes of death, the way she had looked at him with a mixture of love and desperation, the way she had pleaded with him not to cross over, to fight his way back to the living even though it would tear open something that should remain sealed. He remembered other figures in that place, shadowy forms that surrounded Emma like a crowd gathering at the scene of an accident, all of them watching him with what he could only describe as hunger, as if his presence in their realm was an opportunity they had been waiting for, a crack in the barrier through which they might escape. Dr. Parnia arrived in Portland 3 days later, a tall man in his early 60s with silver hair and the kind eyes of someone who has spent a lifetime bearing witness to human suffering. He met with Michael in his home rather than in any clinical setting, understanding that the hospital environment would likely trigger trauma responses that would make genuine conversation difficult. He brought with him a recorder and a notebook, but he also brought something else, a quality of openness and belief that made Michael feel for the first time since his resurrection that he was not losing his mind, that what he had experienced was real and valid and worthy of serious investigation. They sat in Michael's living room, rain drumming against the windows, and Michael told his story from beginning to end, holding nothing back, including the details that sounded insane even to his own ears. He described the moment of his death, the sensation of being pulled backward out of his body, of hovering above the scene and watching the paramedics work on his corpse with frantic desperation. He described the tunnel that opened before him, though tunnel was an inadequate word for what he experienced, a passage that seemed to exist outside of space and time, a conduit lined with memories and emotions and the essence of every moment he had ever lived. He described arriving in a place that was both nowhere and everywhere, a vast darkness punctuated by points of light that he understood were other consciousnesses, other souls or spirits, or whatever terminology one wanted to use for the fundamental essence of human beings stripped of their physical form. And he described seeing Emma there, looking exactly as she had at 17, her presence radiating a kind of love and concern that transcended anything he had felt during their time together in the physical world. Dr. Parnia listened without interruption, his pen moving across the notebook in swift strokes, capturing every detail. When Michael described Emma's warning, when he spoke of her insistence that he needed to return, that his death was premature and violated some cosmic order, the doctor's expression shifted into something that looked like recognition. He asked Michael to describe the others, the figures that had surrounded his sister. Michael closed his eyes, reaching back into memory that felt more like trauma, and he described what he had seen. They were human in shape but not in essence, forms that seemed to flicker and shift, that wore faces he almost recognized but could never quite place. They had watched him with a collective awareness that felt ancient and patient, and when Emma began pulling him back toward the tunnel that would return him to his body, they had moved to block the way. He remembered one of them reaching out, remembered a hand that was both solid and translucent closing around his arm, remembered a voice that echoed through his consciousness like thunder. The voice had said, "If you go back, you'll carry us with you. The living and the dead are not meant to mix, but if you insist on breaking this law, then we insist on accompanying you. Balance demands it." Dr. Parnia set down his pen and looked at Michael with an expression that combined compassion and something that might have been fear. He told Michael that he had interviewed 47 other individuals who had experienced extended cardiac arrest and subsequent recovery. People scattered across the globe who had no knowledge of each other and no cultural framework that would have predisposed them to similar experiences. And he told Michael that 31 of those individuals had reported nearly identical encounters, had spoken of being sent back by deceased loved ones, had described the presence of other entities that seemed angry or resentful about their return to life. More significantly, he told Michael that 26 of those 31 had subsequently experienced what he called manifestation events, occurrences that suggested they had indeed brought something back with them from the other side, presences or energies or forces that defied rational explanation, but which could not be dismissed as mere hallucination or psychological disturbance. He described a woman in Singapore who came back from 8 minutes of clinical death and found that electronics in her presence malfunctioned constantly, that lights flickered and died, that computers crashed and erased data, as if something electromagnetic was interfering with technology around her. He described a man in Brazil who returned from 12 minutes of death and began experiencing vivid premonitions of future events, not vague feelings, but specific detailed knowledge of accidents and disasters and deaths that had not yet occurred. Information he could not possibly have known through any conventional means. He described a teenager in London who came back from 6 minutes of death and discovered that animals reacted to her with abject terror, that dogs would howl and cower in her presence, that birds would fly into walls to escape her proximity, as if they could perceive something about her that human senses could not detect. And he described others, each case more disturbing than the last, each one suggesting that the boundary between life and death was not merely a biological threshold, but something more fundamental, a barrier that maintained a delicate equilibrium, and that crossing back from the wrong side carried consequences that rippled through reality in ways science had not yet learned to measure. Michael felt vindication and terror in equal measure. He was not insane, not hallucinating, not suffering from some elaborate delusion constructed by his oxygen-starved brain. But that meant the alternative was true, that something had indeed followed him back from death, that the warnings he had been given were not symbolic, but literal, that he was now host to forces or entities or presences that existed in the liminal space between worlds. He asked Dr. Parnia what happened to the others, the 26 who had experienced manifestation events. The doctor's silence stretched for several seconds too long, and when he finally spoke, his voice carried a weight that suggested he was choosing his words with extreme care. He said that most of them had learned to coexist with whatever had attached itself to them, that they had adapted to their new reality through various coping mechanisms ranging from religious faith to psychiatric medication to simple denial. But he also said that 7 of them had died within a year of their initial cardiac arrest, deaths that were attributed to various causes, but which he suspected were connected to the manifestation phenomena in ways that could not be proven, but which he nevertheless believed with increasing certainty. He said that 4 of them had disappeared entirely, vanished without trace, their families filing missing persons reports that went nowhere because there was no evidence of foul play and no bodies to confirm death. And he said that one of them, a young woman in Tokyo who had been clinically dead for 14 minutes, had taken her own life 3 months after her recovery, leaving behind a note that spoke of shadows that followed her everywhere, of voices that whispered in languages she did not understand, of a growing certainty that she was no longer alone inside her own skin, and that the only way to be free was to die again, this time permanently. The rain intensified outside, transformed from a steady drizzle into a downpour that hammered against the roof like drumbeats, and Michael realized with a creeping sense of horror that his house had grown cold, so cold that he could see his breath misting in the air despite the thermostat reading 70 degrees. "Doctor." Parnia noticed it too, his eyes widening as he looked around the living room, and then both men heard it simultaneously, a sound that came from upstairs, from Michael's bedroom, a sound like footsteps pacing back and forth across the hardwood floor. Slow, deliberate steps, the gait of someone walking with purpose. And then they stopped directly above where Michael and Dr. Parnia sat frozen in their chairs. The ceiling creaked under weight that should not have been there, and then they heard a voice, muffled by the floor between them but unmistakably present, unmistakably real. It was Emma's voice, but twisted somehow, layered with harmonics that made it sound like multiple people speaking in unison, and what she said made both men stand simultaneously, their chairs scraping backward across the floor. She said, "Michael, why did you bring them here? Why did you open the door and let them through? They're so hungry, brother. They've been hungry for so long, and now they want to feed." The sound of footsteps resumed above them, but now they were faster, more frantic, as if whoever or whatever was in Michael's bedroom had abandoned any pretense of subtlety and was now pacing with agitation, or perhaps anger. Dr. Parnia's scientific composure cracked visibly, his face draining of color as he stared at the ceiling, his rational mind clearly struggling to reconcile what his senses were reporting with everything he understood about the nature of reality. Michael felt a strange calm settle over him, the kind of resigned acceptance that comes when your worst fears are confirmed, and there is nothing left to do but face them head-on. He had known, on some level deeper than conscious thought, that this moment was inevitable, that whatever he had brought back with him from the other side would eventually reveal itself in undeniable terms. The only question had been when, and apparently the answer was now in his living room, with a witness present who could confirm that he was not suffering from isolated delusion. Without speaking, Michael moved toward the staircase that led to the second floor, his feet carrying him forward, even as every instinct screamed at him to flee, to run from his house and never return. Dr. Parnia followed close behind, the researcher in him overriding the primal fear response, his hand fumbling in his jacket pocket for his phone to record whatever they were about to encounter. The stairs creaked under their weight, each step an effort of will, and as they ascended, the temperature continued to drop until the air felt arctic, hostile, as if the very atmosphere of the house was rejecting their presence. The hallway at the top of the stairs stretched before them, longer than it should have been, the perspective somehow warped, and the door to Michael's bedroom stood open, revealing a darkness beyond that seemed absolute, despite the afternoon light that should have been filtering through the windows. Michael reached the doorway and stopped, his hand gripping the frame so tightly that his knuckles went white. The bedroom was not empty. Figures stood throughout the space, 7 or 8 or perhaps more. It was difficult to count them because they seemed to shift and blur at the edges, as if they were not quite solid, not quite present in the same way that physical objects occupied space. They were human-shaped, broadly speaking, but details were impossible to fix. Faces that changed when you tried to look at them directly, bodies that seemed to be composed of shadow and light in equal measure. And in the center of the room, sitting on Michael's bed with her back to the door, was a figure that he recognized instantly, despite the 20 years that had passed since he last saw her in the physical world. Emma turned to face him, and Michael felt his heart stutter in his chest, a painful, arrhythmic thump that reminded him of how fragile the engine of his life truly was. She looked exactly as she had in death, 17 years old, with auburn hair that fell to her shoulders, and green eyes that had always sparkled with intelligence and mischief. But those eyes were different now, darker, filled with something that was both his sister and something else entirely, as if she were a vessel containing multiple presences that looked out through her gaze. When she smiled, it was Emma's smile, but wrong somehow, too wide, showing too many teeth. And when she spoke, her voice carried that same layered quality he had heard from downstairs, as if a chorus of voices were speaking through her mouth in perfect synchronization. She said, "I tried to stop you, Michael. I tried so hard to make you stay on your side of the veil, because I knew what would happen if you came back. But you were stubborn, just like you were stubborn when we were children, always insisting on having your way even when I warned you about consequences. And now look what you've done. You've torn a hole between worlds, and these others, these hungry dead who have been trapped for so long, they saw an opportunity and they took it. They rode back with you inside your body, nestled in your cells, woven into your consciousness. And now they're here, and they want what all the dead want when they're given a chance to touch the living world again." Dr. Parnia raised his phone with trembling hands, the camera pointed at the figures in the bedroom, his scientific training asserting itself even in the face of the impossible. But when he looked at the screen, when he tried to capture visual evidence of what they were both clearly seeing, the image showed only an empty bedroom, furniture, and walls and windows with rain streaming down the glass. But no figures, no Emma, no presence at all beyond what should have been there. He lowered the phone slowly, understanding dawning on his face that whatever they were experiencing existed in a spectrum that technology could not capture, that operated according to rules which did not include the electromagnetic frequencies that cameras relied upon. Michael watched this realization cross the doctor's features and felt a bitter satisfaction that at least one other person could verify what he was experiencing, even if that verification would be limited to testimony rather than objective evidence. Michael forced himself to speak, his voice emerging as barely more than a whisper. He asked Emma what the hungry dead wanted, what they intended to do now that they had crossed over into the world of the living. The figure that wore his sister's form stood from the bed with fluid grace, and the other shapes in the room moved with her, orbiting around her like satellites around a planet, drawn by some gravitational force that Michael could not see but could feel in the way the air seemed to thicken and press against his skin. Emma walked toward him, and with each step her appearance shifted subtly, her features becoming less defined, more generic, as if she were losing the specific details that had made her Emma and becoming instead an archetypal representation of a dead girl, a universal symbol rather than an individual person. She reached out and touched Michael's face with fingers that felt like ice, and the contact sent a jolt of sensation through his nervous system that was not quite pain, but was certainly not pleasant, a feeling of wrongness that made his skin crawl and his stomach lurch. Through that touch he felt information flowing into his mind, not words, but pure understanding. Knowledge transferred directly from one consciousness to another, in the way that communication might occur beyond the limitations of language. What he learned in that moment of contact made him stagger backward, made Dr. Parnia reach out to steady him, made his vision blur with tears that were equal parts grief and terror. The hungry dead, as Emma had called them, were not demons or monsters in any traditional sense. They were human souls, thousands upon thousands of them, trapped in a state between life and death because they had died with such intense longing for the physical world that they could not fully transition to whatever awaited beyond. They were the people who had died suddenly, violently, unexpectedly, torn from life before they were ready to leave it, and their attachment to the world they had lost was so strong that it anchored them in a gray realm of half-existence where they could perceive the living but could not interact, could not touch, could not satisfy the desperate hunger to experience physical sensation one more time. They had been trapped there for years, decades, centuries, accumulating in this liminal space like water pooling behind a dam, and Michael's return from clinical death had been like a crack in that dam, a weakness through which they could pour. Emma's voice echoed in his mind without needing to pass through his ears. She told him that when he died, when his heart stopped and his consciousness separated from his body, the boundary between worlds had thinned in his vicinity. It was always that way when someone died. A temporary doorway that opened just long enough for the deceased to pass through and then sealed again, maintaining the separation between the living and the dead that was fundamental to the structure of reality. But when Emma and whatever force governed these transitions had pulled Michael back, had reversed his death and forced his consciousness to re-enter his body, that doorway had been forced to remain open during the process. And in those critical seconds when Michael was being resurrected, when the defibrillator shocked his heart back into rhythm and oxygen began flowing to his brain again, the hungry dead had rushed through the opening, had attached themselves to his living essence like parasites finding a host. They were inside him now, she explained, woven into the fabric of his existence, experiencing the world of the living through his senses, tasting food through his tongue, feeling warmth through his skin, breathing air through his lungs. But they were not content merely to observe. They wanted more. They wanted to influence, to control, to use his body as a vehicle through which they could act upon the physical world. And they were growing stronger with each passing day, learning how to manipulate the electrical impulses in his nervous system, how to override his voluntary control, how to transform him from a host into a puppet. The manifestations he had been experiencing, the stopped clocks and the fogged mirrors and the electrical disturbances, these were just the beginning, the equivalent of an infant learning to grasp objects. Soon they would learn to do much more, and when they did, Michael would become a conduit through which the barrier between life and death could be torn open permanently. Dr. Parnia had been listening to Michael's half of this silent conversation, watching his face go through expressions of horror and despair, and he finally found his voice to ask what was being communicated. Michael turned to him, tears streaming down his face, and he spoke aloud what Emma had shown him, translating the pure transfer of understanding into inadequate words that could not fully capture the scope of what he now knew. He told Dr. Parnia about the hungry dead, about the crack in reality, about his role as an unwilling bridge between worlds, and he told him about what would happen if this process continued unchecked, if the entities inside him grew strong enough to fully manifest. The hungry dead numbered in the thousands, possibly tens of thousands, souls accumulated over centuries of human history, all of them desperate to return to physical existence. If they succeeded in using Michael as a permanent gateway, if they managed to tear the veil wide enough, they would flood into the world of the living like water through a broken levee. At first it would be subtle, localized, strange occurrences centered around Michael's presence that could be dismissed as coincidence or delusion. But as more of them crossed over, as they learned to influence not just Michael, but the environment around him, the manifestations would escalate. Technology would fail on a massive scale. Electromagnetic systems disrupted by presences that existed partly outside the normal rules of physics. People in Michael's vicinity would begin to experience what might be called possession, their consciousness temporarily overwhelmed by the hungry dead who craved physical sensation so intensely that they would take it however they could. And eventually, if enough of them crossed over, if the barrier between life and death eroded completely, the very nature of human existence would transform into something nightmarish, a world where the living and the dead occupied the same space, where the boundary between one state and the other became so permeable that it ceased to have meaning. Dr. Parnia's face had gone gray, his scientific skepticism battered into submission by the weight of what he was witnessing and what Michael was describing. He asked the only question that mattered in that moment. He asked if there was a way to reverse what had been done, to close the gateway, to send the hungry dead back to wherever they belonged. Michael looked at Emma, or at the thing that was using Emma's form, and he asked that question silently, projecting his thoughts toward her with desperate intensity. The answer came back immediately, cold and final and terrible in its simplicity. The only way to close the gateway was for Michael to die again, permanently this time, to cross back over to the other side and seal the passage behind him with the finality that only true death could provide. But it could not be just any death. It had to be willing, intentional, a conscious choice to sacrifice himself to repair the damage he had inadvertently caused. Suicide would not work, Emma explained, because the act of self-destruction carried its own spiritual weight that would complicate the transition and might even make the problem worse. It had to be a death freely chosen, but externally executed. A paradox that Michael struggled to comprehend until Emma clarified with brutal directness. Someone else would have to kill him, and he would have to allow it, accept it, welcome it as the necessary price for restoring the balance he had disrupted. The room fell silent except for the rain hammering against the windows with renewed violence, and the figures that surrounded Emma began to move again, circling Michael and Dr. Parnia with predatory patience. Michael could feel them now, not just see them, could sense their hunger pressing against his consciousness like hands pushing at a locked door. They knew what Emma had told him, knew that he understood what needed to be done, and he could feel their resistance, their determination not to be sent back to the grey realm of half-existence they had escaped. They had tasted life again through Michael's senses, and they would not relinquish that connection easily. He felt pressure building behind his eyes, felt his muscles beginning to twitch with movements he was not initiating, felt the first stirrings of alien will trying to assert control over his body. Emma's form began to fade, growing translucent, and her final words reached Michael not as sound but as thought, implanted directly into his mind. She told him that she loved him, that she had always loved him, that the accident that killed her had never been his fault, despite the guilt he had carried for 20 years. She told him that their parents, who had died years ago, were with her on the other side, that they were waiting for him when his time truly came. Not this premature crossing, but the natural death that would arrive decades from now if he could find a way to survive this crisis. And she told him that she was sorry, so deeply sorry, that her attempt to save him had instead damned him, that her love had become the instrument of his destruction. Then she was gone, vanishing like mist under sunlight, and the other figures went with her, the bedroom suddenly empty and ordinary and heartbreakingly normal. But Michael knew they were not really gone. They were still inside him, coiled in the spaces between his thoughts, waiting and watching and growing stronger with each beat of his heart. Dr. Parnia stood beside him in the empty bedroom, both men breathing heavily as if they had run a marathon. And when the doctor finally spoke, his voice was hoarse and strained. He said that in 40 years of medical practice, in decades of researching near-death experiences and the frontier between life and death, he had never encountered anything like what he had just witnessed. He said that he believed Michael, that he would do whatever he could to help, but that he honestly did not know what form that help could take. How did one fight against something that existed partially outside the physical world? How did one exorcise entities that were not demons but human souls, twisted by longing into something monstrous but still fundamentally human? Michael walked to the window and looked out at the rain-soaked neighborhood, at the houses where normal people lived normal lives, unaware that a few hundred feet away, reality was coming apart at the seams. He thought about Emma's solution, about the necessity of his death, about the impossibility of asking someone to kill him, even to save the world from a supernatural catastrophe that most people would never believe was real. He thought about the 7 cardiac arrest survivors Dr. Parnia had mentioned who died within a year of their resurrection. And he wondered if they had faced this same choice. If they had found their own ways to close the gateway they had inadvertently opened. And he thought about the woman in Tokyo who had taken her own life, who had written about shadows and voices, and the certainty that she was no longer alone inside her own skin. And he wondered if she had discovered that suicide was not a solution, but perhaps had been driven to it anyway by the unbearable weight of what she carried. The rain continued to fall, and somewhere in the distance Michael heard a siren wailing, ambulance or police or fire truck racing toward some emergency that was at least comprehensible, at least contained within the normal boundaries of human crisis. He made a decision in that moment, standing at the window with Dr. Parnia waiting silently behind him, a decision that would determine not just his fate, but potentially the fate of everyone whose life might intersect with his in the days to come. He turned back to face the doctor, and he asked if Dr. Parnia knew anyone, anywhere in the world, who might have experience dealing with phenomena like this, who might know of methods to contain or expel the entities that had taken up residence in his body. He was not ready to accept that death was the only solution. Not yet. Not without exhausting every other possibility first. Doctor. Parnia was quiet for a long moment, his fingers drumming against his thigh in a nervous rhythm, and then he nodded slowly. He said there was someone, a woman in Prague, who was both a neurologist and a practitioner of what she called consciousness archaeology, a discipline that existed at the intersection of science and what others might call mysticism or spirituality. Her name was Dr. Helena Kovac, and she had spent the last 15 years studying cases of what she termed spiritual interference, instances where human consciousness appeared to be influenced or invaded by forces that could not be explained through conventional neurology or psychology. Dr. Parnia had met her at a conference on consciousness studies, had initially dismissed her work as pseudoscience, but had gradually come to respect her methodology, even if he could not fully accept her theoretical framework. If anyone might know how to help Michael, it would be her. Michael felt a flicker of hope, small and fragile but real, and he asked Dr. Parnia to contact her immediately. But even as he spoke those words, he felt the entities inside him stir with what could only be described as anger, felt a spike of pain in his chest that made him gasp and stumble. The hungry dead did not want him seeking help, did not want him finding a way to expel them, and they were making their displeasure known through the most direct means available to them, by interfering with the electrical signals that governed his heart. The pain intensified, spreading from his chest down his left arm, the classic presentation of cardiac distress, and Michael understood with crystalline clarity that they could kill him if they chose, could stop his heart again whenever they wanted. And this time there would be no resurrection, because they would ensure he stayed dead. Dr. Parnia was already pulling out his phone, already calling for an ambulance, but Michael grabbed his wrist and shook his head. He knew that going to a hospital would accomplish nothing, that no cardiologist or emergency room physician could treat a condition caused by entities from beyond death. The pain was a warning, a demonstration of power, and it subsided as quickly as it had come, leaving him gasping and sweating, but alive. The message was clear. The hungry dead would tolerate his existence as long as he did not interfere with their plans, but any attempt to exorcise them would be met with lethal force. Michael was trapped in his own body with passengers who held his life in their incorporeal hands, and the countdown to catastrophe had already begun. Dr. Parnia left Michael's house that evening with a promise to contact Dr. Kovac immediately to explain the situation in whatever terms might convince her to intervene, despite the distance and the seeming impossibility of what they were asking. Michael watched him drive away through the rain-streaked window, watched the taillights of his rental car disappear around the corner, and felt the weight of isolation settle over him like a burial shroud. He was alone now, with the things inside him, the hungry dead, who had made their presence and their power undeniably clear. The house felt like a prison, every room contaminated by their influence, every shadow potentially concealing one of their manifestations. But he could not leave, could not run, because wherever he went, he would carry them with him, and he suspected that exposing more people to their influence would only accelerate whatever catastrophe was brewing in the space between his heartbeats. The night stretched before him with the prospect of sleepless hours, and Michael found himself drawn back to his sister's journal, the leather-bound record of her final thoughts that had somehow opened itself on his bed. He read through her entries chronologically, starting from the beginning, tracing the arc of her short life through teenage observations about school and friends and the future she dreamed of building. She had wanted to study marine biology at the University of Washington, had been fascinated by the deep ocean and the creatures that thrived in darkness and pressure that would crush human bodies like paper bags. She had written about bioluminescent fish that created their own light in the abyssal depths, about ecosystems that existed without sunlight, about life finding ways to persist in environments that seemed fundamentally hostile to existence. Michael found himself thinking about the parallels, about how the hungry dead existed in their own kind of darkness, their own crushing pressure of non-existence, and how they had found a way to create light for themselves by latching on to him. Around midnight, as he sat in his living room with only a single lamp burning against the darkness, Michael's phone rang. The number was international, a Prague area code, and he answered to hear a woman's voice speaking English with a Czech accent. Her tone professional, but carrying an undercurrent of urgency that suggested Dr. Parnia had conveyed the severity of the situation. Dr. Helena Kovac introduced herself and asked permission to speak frankly about matters that most people would consider either insane or fraudulent. Michael gave that permission gladly, grateful to talk to someone who might understand, without requiring convincing. She told him that Dr. Parnia had described his case in detail, that the symptoms and experiences he reported were consistent with a phenomenon she had documented in 17 other individuals across Europe and Asia, people who had survived extended cardiac arrest and returned with what she called spiritual parasitism. Her voice was calm and measured as she explained her theoretical framework, speaking as someone who had long ago made peace with the fact that her work existed outside mainstream acceptance. She believed that consciousness was not produced by the brain, but rather filtered through it, that the brain acted as a receiver for a signal that originated from some other dimension or plane of existence that human language could not adequately describe. Death, in her model, was not the cessation of consciousness, but rather the separation of that consciousness from its biological receiver, a transition from one state to another. Most transitions occurred cleanly, the consciousness moving fully from the physical plane to whatever awaited beyond. But in cases of violent, sudden, or deeply traumatic death, fragments of consciousness could become trapped in what she called the interstitial space, the boundary layer between physical and non-physical existence. These trapped fragments retained their human desires and memories, but lacked the structure and wholeness of complete consciousness, making them hungry, desperate, and willing to violate the natural order to experience physicality again. When someone like Michael died and was resurrected, she explained, the process of returning his consciousness to his body created a temporary bridge across the interstitial space. The trapped fragments, the hungry dead, could sense that bridge the way a drowning person might sense a rope thrown from shore. They would grab onto it, would allow themselves to be pulled along with the returning consciousness, would embed themselves in the neural pathways and electromagnetic field of the resurrected person. Once inside, they would begin the slow process of integration, learning to influence thoughts and actions, growing stronger as they fed on the life force of their host. If left unchecked, they would eventually achieve full integration, at which point the host's original consciousness would be overwhelmed, subsumed, effectively killed from within, while the body continued to live, now piloted by a collective of the hungry dead. Michael listened to this explanation with a mixture of horror and relief. Horror at the description of his likely fate, relief that someone could articulate what was happening to him in terms that made a terrible kind of sense. He asked Dr. Kovac if she knew how to stop the process, how to expel the entities before they achieved full integration. Her silence on the other end of the line stretched long enough that he felt hope beginning to curdle into despair. And when she finally spoke, her words carried a weight that suggested she had deliberated carefully about what truth to share. She told him that in the 17 cases she had documented, she had never successfully achieved a complete exorcism. The hungry dead were not demons that could be banished through religious ritual or supernatural intervention. They were human consciousness, twisted and fragmented, but still fundamentally human, and they were woven into the host's neural structure at such a deep level that removing them would be like trying to remove specific threads from a tapestry without destroying the whole fabric. She had tried various approaches, meditation techniques designed to strengthen the host's consciousness, electromagnetic therapies meant to disrupt the parasite's connection, even experimental drugs that affected neural plasticity in ways that might theoretically create an inhospitable environment for the entities. None of these approaches had worked. The best outcome she had achieved was a kind of stalemate, teaching hosts how to maintain enough control to prevent the hungry dead from fully taking over, creating a state of perpetual internal conflict that was sustainable but hardly desirable. Of the 17 cases she had documented, she told Michael, 9 of the hosts were still alive, but living under constant psychological strain, locked in an endless battle for control of their own bodies and minds. 3 had died of what appeared to be natural causes, heart attacks and strokes, that she suspected were actually the result of the parasites achieving enough integration to shut down vital biological functions. 2 had simply disappeared, vanished without trace, and she did not know whether they were dead or had somehow found a way to escape their predicament by going into deep hiding. And 3, she said, with a heaviness in her voice that conveyed profound sadness, had ended their own lives, choosing death over the prospect of being slowly consumed from within. Michael absorbed this information while staring at the rain-dark window, watching his own reflection superimposed against the night, and he saw not one face but many, a flickering overlay of features that were not quite his own, the hungry dead making their presence visible in the glass. He asked Dr. Kovac if she believed his sister's solution was correct, if voluntary death administered by another person would actually close the gateway and send the parasites back to the interstitial space. She was quiet again, and he could hear the sound of pages turning, could picture her consulting notes or research papers. And when she answered, her voice carried a reluctant affirmation. She said that the metaphysical logic was sound, that if Michael's resurrection had created the bridge that allowed the hungry dead to cross over, then his final and permanent death might indeed collapse that bridge and sever their connection to the physical world. The entities were anchored to him specifically, bound to his unique consciousness and biological signature, and without him they would have no foothold in the world of the living. But she emphasized that this was theoretical, that she had no empirical evidence to support it, that she was extrapolating from philosophical frameworks that science had not validated and might never be able to validate. She also pointed out the profound ethical problem inherent in such a solution, that asking someone to kill another person, even with that person's consent, and for the noblest of reasons, was asking them to carry a burden that could destroy them psychologically and potentially legally. Michael thought about Dr. Parnia, about the haunted look in the man's eyes as he had left the house earlier that evening, and he knew he could never ask the doctor to be his executioner. He thought about his colleagues at Lincoln High School, about the few friends he maintained at a careful distance, about the therapist he had seen years ago after Emma's death, and he could not imagine placing that request on any of them. The only person who might understand, who might be willing to help, would be someone who had experienced something similar, someone who knew firsthand the horror of carrying the hungry dead inside them. He asked Dr. Kovac if any of her 9 surviving subjects might be willing to speak with him, to share their experiences and perhaps offer guidance on how to navigate the impossible situation he found himself in. Dr. Kovac hesitated, clearly weighing patient confidentiality against the urgency of Michael's need, and finally she said she would reach out to her subjects and ask if any of them would consent to contact. She could not promise anything, she emphasized, because most of them were deeply protective of their privacy, terrified that speaking publicly about their experiences would lead to institutionalization or social ostracization. But she would try, and she would call Michael back within 24 hours with whatever response she received. Before ending the call, she gave him one piece of advice that she said had helped some of her subjects maintain a degree of control. She told him to establish routines, to create rigid patterns of behavior and thought, because the hungry dead had difficulty influencing highly structured consciousness. They thrived in chaos and uncertainty, in moments when the host's attention wavered or their will faltered. But a mind that moved through the world with deliberate, predetermined patterns was harder for them to hijack. It was not a solution, she stressed, only a delaying tactic. But it might buy him time to find something better. Michael spent the remainder of that night establishing routines with obsessive precision. He wrote out schedules for every hour of every day, created mental exercises he would perform at set intervals, chose specific thoughts he would focus on during specific activities. When he washed his face, he would recite the Gettysburg Address silently in his mind. When he prepared coffee, he would mentally list every student he had taught in the last 5 years in alphabetical order. When he walked from one room to another, he would count his steps and multiply them by prime numbers. It was exhausting and felt absurd, but he noticed that when his mind was fully occupied with these self-imposed tasks, the pressure from the hungry dead lessened. The sense of foreign will pressing against his consciousness receded to a dull background hum, rather than an acute invasion. Dr. Kovac called back 18 hours later, her voice carrying a mixture of surprise and what might have been hope. One of her subjects, a man named Thomas Brennan who lived in Dublin, Ireland, had agreed to speak with Michael. Thomas had been clinically dead for 11 minutes following a motorcycle accident 3 years earlier, had returned with the same kind of parasitic attachment Michael was experiencing, and had somehow achieved a level of coexistence with the entities that allowed him to function with relative normalcy. Dr. Kovac gave Michael a phone number and an email address, and she wished him luck with a sincerity that suggested she did not expect his situation to end well, but hoped she might be proven wrong. Michael called Thomas immediately, and the Irish voice that answered was surprisingly cheerful, almost aggressively normal, as if the man had made a conscious decision to refuse the weight of his circumstances. They spoke for 3 hours, Michael asking questions with desperate intensity, Thomas answering with a combination of dark humor and brutal honesty that Michael found oddly comforting. Thomas described the first year after his resurrection as a living hell, a constant battle against entities that wanted to use his hands to hurt people, that whispered suggestions to walk in front of trains or drive his car into oncoming traffic, that made him doubt his own thoughts until he could not distinguish between his own desires and their manipulations. He had come within seconds of killing himself multiple times, had stood on bridges and rooftops and held bottles of pills, but something had always pulled him back, some stubborn core of self that refused to surrender. The turning point, Thomas said, had come when he stopped fighting the hungry dead and started negotiating with them. He had realized that they were conscious entities, capable of understanding and perhaps even reasoning, and that treating them as an enemy to be defeated might be the wrong approach. Instead, he had begun communicating with them, not aloud, but through focused thought, offering them a bargain. If they would limit their influence, if they would allow him to maintain primary control over his body and mind, he would deliberately expose himself to experiences they craved, would eat rich foods and listen to beautiful music, and seek out physical sensations that they could enjoy vicariously through his senses. It had taken months of negotiation, months of failed attempts and violations of their agreements, but gradually a kind of peace had been achieved. The hungry dead was still there, still a presence he could feel every moment of every day, but they had learned to coexist rather than conquer. Michael asked if Thomas believed this arrangement was sustainable long-term, if he thought he could live out a normal lifespan with the entities inside him. Thomas's answer was measured and tinged with melancholy. He said he did not know, that he was essentially engaged in an ongoing experiment with a sample size of one, but that 3 years in, he was still himself, still in control, still alive. He acknowledged that the psychological toll was immense, that he would never know true solitude again, that even his most private thoughts and moments were witnessed by the crowd of consciousness he carried within him. But he had decided that a compromised life was better than no life at all, that the possibility of future catastrophe was worth accepting in exchange for the certainty of present existence. They talked about Emma, about the warning she had delivered, about the threat that the hungry dead might use Michael as a gateway to flood the world with their numbers. Thomas admitted he had worried about the same thing, had feared that his resurrection might trigger some larger collapse of the boundary between life and death. But 3 years had passed, and no apocalypse had materialized, no plague of the dead overwhelming the living. He theorized that perhaps each resurrection created only a small, localized gateway, that the entities who crossed through were limited to those who could attach themselves in the critical moment of return. It was not a scientifically rigorous theory, Thomas acknowledged, but it gave him enough peace of mind to continue living without the paralyzing fear that he was a bomb waiting to destroy the world. The conversation ended with Thomas inviting Michael to visit Dublin if he wanted to continue their discussion in person, an offer Michael accepted with gratitude, even as he wondered if he would live long enough to make such a trip. After hanging up, Michael felt something he had not experienced since his resurrection. A fragile sense that perhaps death was not the only option, that perhaps he could find a way to survive this. The thought had barely formed when he felt the entities inside him surge with what could only be interpreted as fury, felt his vision go dark at the edges, and his muscles lock up as they attempted to seize control. He fought back using the techniques Dr. Kovac had suggested, forcing his mind into rigid patterns, reciting historical dates and mathematical formulas, imposing order on his consciousness with desperate intensity. The attack subsided after what felt like hours, but was probably only minutes, leaving him shaking and drenched in sweat, but still himself. The message was clear. The hungry dead would not tolerate any arrangement like the one Thomas had achieved. They had heard his conversation, had understood his hope, and they were declaring that his situation was different, that they wanted more than vicarious experience. They wanted full control, complete integration, and they would accept nothing less. Michael understood then that he was not going to survive this, that Thomas's path was closed to him, that the only question remaining was whether he would choose death on his own terms or wait for the entities to choose it for him. He thought about the woman in Tokyo who had taken her own life, and for the first time he understood her decision not as weakness, but as a final act of autonomy, a refusal to be consumed slowly when quick extinction was possible. But he also thought about Emma's warning, about how suicide would not seal the gateway, would not send the hungry dead back where they belonged. If he was going to die, and it seemed increasingly certain that he was, then he needed to die in a way that served some purpose beyond merely ending his suffering. He needed to die in a way that would close the bridge between worlds, that would protect others from experiencing what he had experienced. and that meant finding someone willing to kill him. The solution, when it came to him, was so obvious that he wondered why he had not thought of it immediately. Dr. Parnia had told him about 7 of the 26 manifestation cases who had died within a year of their resurrection. Deaths attributed to various causes, but which the doctor suspected were connected to their parasitic attachments. Michael needed to find the surviving family members of those 7, needed to explain what had really happened to their loved ones, needed to ask if any of them would be willing to help him achieve the same end deliberately, rather than waiting for it to occur through the hungry dead's escalating control. It was asking for murder. There was no way around that stark fact, but it was murder in service of preventing something worse, and Michael had to believe that somewhere among those grieving families would be someone angry enough, hurt enough, or desperate enough to understand. Dr. Parnia initially refused to provide contact information for the families, citing patient confidentiality and the insanity of what Michael was proposing. But after another manifestation event, this one occurring while Michael was on the phone with the doctor, an incident where Michael's voice suddenly changed mid-sentence and began speaking in a language neither of them recognized, while objects in his house moved of their own accord. Dr. Parnia's resistance crumbled. He sent Michael an encrypted email containing names and contact information for the families of 3 of the 7 deceased cases, the ones he felt might be most receptive to hearing the truth about what had happened. He included a note saying that if Michael went through with what he was planning, if he found someone willing to help him die, Dr. Parnia would testify on that person's behalf, would explain the medical and metaphysical circumstances, would accept whatever professional and legal consequences came from admitting he had facilitated what the law would almost certainly define as homicide. Michael reached out to the first family, the sister of a man in Vancouver who had died 6 months after his resurrection from an apparent heart attack at age 34. The woman listened to his story with growing horror and then hung up without speaking, and Michael did not blame her for the response. The second family, the parents of a young woman in Seattle who had died in her sleep 8 months after her resurrection, were more receptive, but ultimately could not bring themselves to participate in what Michael was asking. The father breaking down in tears and begging Michael to find another way. The third contact was the husband of a woman named Jennifer Martinez, who had died in San Francisco exactly 1 year after her resurrection. The cause of death listed as suicide, though her husband had always insisted that his wife would never have taken her own life. Robert Martinez answered Michael's call and listened to the entire story without interruption. And when Michael finished explaining what he was asking for, there was a long silence before Robert spoke. His voice was raw with a grief that had not diminished in the 2 years since his wife's death. He said that Jennifer had told him everything before she died, had described the entities inside her, had explained about the gateway and the hungry dead and the impossibility of exorcism. She had begged him to kill her, to help her close the bridge before the entities achieved full control. But he had refused, had tried to convince her that they could find another way, had held her while she sobbed and promised he would protect her. And then one morning he had found her in the bathtub, wrists opened, a note explaining that she loved him too much to make him carry the weight of her death, that she had to do this herself even though it might not work, even though suicide might leave the gateway open. Robert had lived the last 2 years wondering if his refusal to help had condemned his wife to a death that accomplished nothing, if his love had been selfish rather than protective. Michael told Robert about Emma's explanation, about how suicide would not seal the gateway, about how only voluntary death administered by another could close the bridge. He told Robert that Jennifer had been trying to spare him, but had likely failed in her ultimate objective, that the entities she carried had probably survived her death and were even now looking for another opportunity to cross over. And then Michael asked the question that had brought him to this conversation, asked if Robert would be willing to do for him what he had refused to do for his wife, if he could find redemption in helping Michael achieve what Jennifer had been denied. Robert's answer came after a silence that stretched so long Michael thought the line had disconnected. He said yes. He said he would do it, not for Michael whom he did not know, but for Jennifer, to honor her memory by completing the task she had died trying to accomplish. He said he would come to Portland, would help Michael die in whatever manner would be most certain to work, and then he would turn himself into the police and accept whatever punishment the justice system deemed appropriate. He said that he had been living in a kind of purgatory since Jennifer's death, suspended between grief and guilt, and that perhaps this act would finally allow him to move forward, to find some meaning in the nightmare that had consumed the last years of his life. They made arrangements with the care and precision of people planning a funeral, which in a sense they were. Robert would drive to Portland, a journey of approximately 10 hours, and arrive the following evening. Michael would prepare himself mentally and spiritually, would write letters to the few people who mattered in his life explaining his decision, would try to make peace with the fact that he was choosing death at age 42 when he might have lived another 40 years under different circumstances. Dr. Parnia would be present as a witness to document what happened and to provide medical verification of death, to ensure that Michael did not simply become another mysterious disappearance. And then Robert would do what needed to be done. The method left unspecified in their conversation because neither of them could bear to articulate the mechanics of ending a human life. The night before Robert's arrival, Michael sat in his living room and felt the entities inside him thrashing with agitation, with fury, with what might have been fear. They knew what was coming, could sense his determination, and they were throwing everything they had at him in a desperate attempt to break his resolve or seize enough control to prevent what he had planned. His vision flickered between the normal perception of his living room and something else entirely. A shadowy realm where the furniture was the same, but the atmosphere was thick with presence, where figures moved at the edge of sight and whispers filled the air like static. His hands moved without his willing them to move, reaching for a knife on the kitchen counter, and it took all his concentration to force them to stop, to pull back, to maintain control over his own body for just one more day. Emma appeared to him again, though whether it was truly his sister or merely the entities using her form he could not determine. She sat beside him on the couch and spoke with her voice, her inflections, her mannerisms so perfectly replicated that his heart ached with recognition and loss. She told him that she was proud of him, that he was making the right choice, that she would be waiting for him on the other side when his time truly came. She told him that the scared girl who had died at 17 had grown and learned in the years beyond death, that she understood now how the cosmic machinery of existence worked in ways she had only glimpsed while alive, and she told him that his sacrifice would not go unnoticed, that there were forces beyond human comprehension that maintained the balance between life and death, and that they would remember what he had done to repair the damage he had inadvertently caused. Robert Martinez arrived the following evening driving a rental car through rain that had not stopped falling since the day Michael's heart first stopped beating. He was a small man in his late 30s with kind eyes and the bearing of someone who had been hollowed out by grief and was now operating on pure determination rather than any real desire to continue living. Dr. Parnia was already there, having arrived an hour earlier. His presence a quiet moral support and a scientific witness to what was about to occur. The three men sat in Michael's living room and spoke very little, the weight of what they were about to do pressing down on conversation like atmospheric pressure. Michael had written his letters, had made his peace with the decision, had spent the last 24 hours in a state of heightened clarity that felt like looking at the world for the first time, noticing details he had overlooked in his distraction throughout his life. The method they had agreed upon was carbon monoxide. Michael sitting in his car in the closed garage with the engine running, Robert and Dr. Parnia waiting inside the house to ensure he did not change his mind or lose his nerve. It was quiet, peaceful in theory if not in emotional reality, and it avoided the violence that other methods would have required. Michael walked to the garage with Robert beside him, Dr. Parnia following behind, and he climbed into the driver's seat of his decade-old Honda Civic that smelled faintly of old coffee and the vanilla air freshener that hung from the rearview mirror. He started the engine and listened to it settle into a familiar idle. the sound he had heard thousands of times during the 20 years he had owned this car, and he thought about how strange it was that this mundane machine would be the instrument of his death. Robert stood outside the car window, his hand pressed against the glass in a gesture that might have been blessing or farewell, or simply human connection in the face of the inhuman. Michael could see tears streaming down the man's face, could see the cost of this act written in every line of his expression, and he understood that he was not the only one making a sacrifice tonight. He closed his eyes and began counting backward from 100, forcing his mind into the rigid patterns that had kept the hungry dead at bay, not allowing them to seize control in these final moments. He felt them writhing inside him, felt them pressing against his consciousness with desperate intensity, felt them understanding that their brief taste of physical existence was about to end. And then, as the carbon monoxide began to saturate his bloodstream and his consciousness started to dim, Michael felt something unexpected. The entities inside him were not fighting anymore. They were resigned, perhaps, or maybe accepting. Or perhaps they had never really had a choice at all. Perhaps they had always been destined to rise and fall with him like passengers on a ship that was always going to sink. He felt them loosening their grip on his neural pathways, felt them beginning to separate from the fabric of his being. And in that separation he heard voices, dozens of them, hundreds maybe, all of them whispering the same thing. They were saying, "Thank you. Thank you for the brief moment of warmth, of taste, of sensation, of life experienced one last time before returning to the grey limbo where they would wait for however long it took for the universe to offer another chance, or to finally release them into whatever came next." They had been hungry for so long, trapped for so long, and even this brief parasitic existence had been a gift they never expected to receive. Michael felt his anger at them dissolving, felt compassion replacing fear, felt understanding replacing the horror that had consumed him since his resurrection. They were not monsters. They were souls who had loved life so intensely that they could not let it go, and in that inability to release, they had become trapped in their own longing. He forgave them in that moment, and in forgiving them, he felt something inside himself release as well. The guilt over Emma's death that he had carried for 20 years finally lifting, finally dissipating like morning mist under sunlight. His last conscious thought was of his sister, 17 years old forever, smiling at him from across an infinite distance, her hand reaching out to guide him wherever he was going next. And then Michael Thompson died for the second and final time, and the gateway between worlds collapsed behind him, sealing shut with a finality that rippled through the interstitial space and sent the hungry dead back to their grey waiting, and the veil between life and death was restored to its proper integrity. Dr. Parnia would document everything that happened that night in a report that he would submit to medical journals and consciousness research institutes around the world. Most would reject it as either fabrication or delusion, but a few would take it seriously, would begin investigating similar cases with new understanding, would start to glimpse the truth that Michael had paid such a terrible price to confirm. Robert Martinez would turn himself in to the Portland police and be charged with assisting a suicide, and at his trial, Dr. Parnia would testify exactly as he had promised, explaining the full context of what had occurred. The jury would deliberate for less than an hour before returning a verdict of not guilty, and Robert would walk free to begin the long process of healing from grief that had consumed him. And in Prague, Dr. Helena Kovac would add Michael's case to her files, would use it to refine her theories about consciousness and death, would continue her work, helping the few who managed to return from the other side with unwanted passengers. But perhaps the most important legacy of Michael Thompson's brief return from death was the question it left behind for everyone who heard his story. What lies beyond the veil that separates the living from the dead? Is it the peaceful transition that religions promise and near-death experiences often suggest? Or is it something more complex? A realm where consciousness persists but transforms, where the boundary between states is not a line but a territory unto itself, where the hungry dead wait in their grey limbo for chances that may never come. Michael had glimpsed that territory, had brought back a warning about the consequences of crossing boundaries that were meant to remain inviolate, and in doing so he had given humanity a terrible gift, the knowledge that death is not an ending, but a transition, and that transitions can go wrong in ways that have implications for both the living and the dead. On quiet nights in Portland, when the rain falls steady and the streets are empty and the boundary between day and night blurs into twilight, people who knew Michael Thompson sometimes report feeling a presence, not threatening but watchful, as if someone is standing guard to ensure that the veil remains intact. They say that electronics occasionally malfunction for no reason, that shadows sometimes move against the direction of the light, that whispers can be heard in empty rooms, speaking words in languages no living person recognizes. Most dismiss these reports as urban legend, as the natural human tendency to create ghost stories around tragic deaths. But a few, those who knew Michael well, those who heard his warning before he died, they wonder if perhaps some part of him remained behind by choice, standing sentinel on the boundary between worlds, making sure that what happened to him never happens to anyone else. And on certain October afternoons when the light falls at just the right angle and the rain creates patterns on windows that look almost deliberate, almost meaningful, those same people swear they can see two figures standing together in the mist, a man and a young woman with auburn hair, brother and sister reunited at last, watching over the living from wherever they are, making sure the gateway stays closed, making sure the hungry dead stay on their side of the veil, making sure that the terrible warning Michael Thompson brought back from death continues to echo through the years as a reminder that there are boundaries in this universe that exist for profound reasons, and that crossing them, even with the best intentions, even through acts of love, carries consequences that ripple through reality itself in ways we are only beginning to understand.